You must stay at home. Stay at home.
Hello and welcome to Lockdown, hosted by Steve Bomford with Mike Davis-Marks. Our armed forces operate in challenging environments. Week by week, we'll explore what we can learn from their experiences.
Hi Steve, it's been a while since we last sat down and did a podcast together. Summer has happened in between. How's it been for you?
Summer has happened. I feel like it's first day back at school after the school holidays. It was a good summer. Yourself?
Well, I moved house, as you probably know, from Hampshire to Kent. So the whole of the summer was in one way or another connected with that. But I'm now speaking to you from Kent, near Canterbury.
I have no idea why that is, but the sound quality's improved, so that's got to be a good thing.
So what can we tell? So who have you got for our listeners today then?
So we have a gentleman, Pascal Patterson, who is one half of Stars and Spokes, who cycled from Land's End to John O'Groats, who's also in the Royal Navy, of course. And I might have a first here. You don't know him.
Hopefully I will get to know him through this series. But shall we listen to his interview?
I think it would be rude not to. Pascal, thank you very much for agreeing to come on the podcast. I'm quite surprised, actually, that you're not fed up with talking to me after the amount of chats we've had, but thank you.
Yeah, no, I couldn't possibly comment on whether I'm fed up of chatting to you or not, Steve, but no, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me on. Looking forward to the next 45 minutes or so when we get to chat through all things cycling and mental health.
Brilliant. So really, this is going to be about what's happening next as well, isn't it? And what crazy things you're up to. But let's find out a little bit more about you first of all. So, why did you join the Royal Navy, and what's it been like? What have you been up to whilst in the service?
All right. Okay. So I joined the Royal Navy back in 2005. So we're straight into some basic maths here. So I've been surfing for 16 years now, with it being 2021 this year, and I joined the Navy as an aircrew officer. So when you decide to join the Navy or the military more generally, you then pick within that a branch of what you want to do. So within the Navy, you could be driving the warships, you could be in charge of the missiles. I chose to join as an aircrew officer, so all about sort of flying helicopters around the front line, because that seemed like a very appealing thing to do. So as part of that, you join Dartmouth and you do your year-long basic training, which is all your leadership quality type stuff, and there's loads of assessments, and they're just checking that you do have the ability to lead other people. On completion of that, you then move on to your flying training. So the early bits of my career, so the first 4 or 5 years, were all about completing basic flying training and then advanced flying training, and then eventually getting my wings. And then at that point, that's when the adventures and the challenges really start. I mean, it's hard work up to that point, but then once you've got your wings, you kind of let loose on the front line. And over the next sort of 5 or 10 years of my career, a bunch of frontline tours from Afghanistan, so Taliban type stuff, out in the Gulf, so keeping an eye on the Iranians, in Somalia doing counter-piracy stuff, out in the Caribbean doing counter-drug stuff. So a bunch of flying tours, South Atlantic, Far East, kind of all over the world. And what that has offered as a constant throughout really is a challenge. Now, I personally never wanted to end up in a desk job, doing the same sort of thing day in, day out. And what a career in the Royal Navy offered and has delivered is challenge daily. In terms of what you're having to do. It's high pressure, but you get to experience life and live life fully. And the first 16 years have been great. Hopefully I can keep going for another 16 years or so. I'm sort of young enough to get another few years in yet. So yeah, that was kind of my drive. I wanted to experience life and be challenged.
Sounds like that's happened.
Yeah, it has. Yeah, very much so. And some of the situations you find yourselves in, you can get extremely challenged within those sort of situations.
So have you got a desk job now? Is that what you were saying there, or has that not quite happened?
Yeah, so what tends to happen is after sort of multiple frontline operations, frontline tours, you ended up, I've been lucky enough to have been promoted up to the rank of commander, for those who understand that rank in the Royal Navy, so equivalent to like Lieutenant Colonel in the Army, if you're more familiar with that. And what that means is you tend to be put into kind of strategy or policy type jobs, so less of the frontline stuff, more organising about what happens on the front line, and others kind of do the doing. So that's where I'm at the moment, which is good. Where I'm trying to get to over the next couple of years is move more towards the attaché world. So working as a defence attaché or a naval attaché. So working in embassies around the world, and taking forward sort of UK interests in other embassies and countries around the world on sort of a rolling 2 or 3 year basis. So you go to one country for a bit, whether that's the States, and you talk to those guys about what the UK is trying to achieve there, or then you end up in West Africa or China, wherever it may be. So that's where I'm headed next in terms of my career.
That sounds interesting. Is that like where you have the Ferrero Rocher for the ambassador?
I knew it. I absolutely knew you were going to go there with the Ferrero Rocher. We just can't talk seriously about anything, can we? So yeah, every embassy, there's just like this big storeroom, which is full of Ferrero Rocher. And day one training is handing out Ferrero Rochers to other ambassadors. Yes, Steve. Yeah.
Excellent. Now I know what you all do at Dartmouth. Let's move on. Right. So you're one half of Stars and Spokes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But your friend Dan, who unfortunately wasn't able to participate in the Land's End to John O'Groats, how did you meet Dan, and what was your original plan?
Oh, crikey. Okay, so 2 completely separate things there. Right, so how did I meet Dan? So when you go to Dartmouth in the first instance to do your basic officer training, there are what are called intakes. So 3 or 4 times of the year, you get 100 individuals turn up, basically civvies off the street, and they are turned into military officers through that militarization bit at Dartmouth. Now, I was in the same intake as Dan, so within that same 100 as Dan, but when you first join, you then sub-split into groups of around about 30, and you're sent off into your own little dorm rooms, and then you're kind of within that close-knit group of 30 within that wider intake. Now, Dan and I were in separate intakes, so I didn't have that much to do with him sort of straight off, but I can remember one of the key meetings I had with Dan, the first time I really got to know him as an individual. I was out in the car park at Dartmouth. I went out to get something from my car or put something in my car, and I opened the door and I was fiddling around doing bits and bobs, and he started approaching me from on the horizon. He was like, "Hello, I'm Dan. Have you got a car?" And I was like, "Well, yes, Dan, because otherwise I'm breaking into a car. So yes, I've got a car. This is the car." And he was stood there, and immediately I thought, this guy I think is going to be quite funny. And he had a jerry can in his hand, and this is just textbook Dan. So I was like, "Yeah, I've got a car. Why have you got a jerry can?" And then he launched into this story about when the first day at Dartmouth, he turned up on his motorbike, as one of the things Dan does, and his motorbike had run out of petrol literally as he came through the front gate at Dartmouth. So he'd got there fine, ready for day one, but then had to push his motorbike up this hill and stored it in the garage for the first few weeks. He's like, "Right, we'll park that problem there and we'll come back to it." But then in our first bit of leave, which was approaching, he wanted to go away, but obviously couldn't because his motorbike had no petrol in it. So I said, "Right, get in the car. We'll go up to the petrol station." So we headed up to the petrol station, and he told me a few stories along the way, and we got chatting. That was the first time we properly got to know one another. And immediately I thought, this guy likes adventures. He wants to experience life. Listening to some of his backstory, he's already done that. Some of it's gone well, some of it has gone less well. And that's just great, because storytelling is what it's all about, I think, and experiencing life. So that was my first contact with Dan. And it really grew from there, because we approached life, I think, in a similar kind of way. And then going forth, he also joined as an aircrew officer. So when we left Dartmouth, which for awareness is the equivalent of like Sandhurst for the army, basically. When we left Dartmouth, we went on to basic flying training together. For of those 4 or 5 years, there's stages of flying training. We were together in basic flying training, and that's where we really solidified our friendship. And then since then, we've been going off and outside of the military, having adventures and trips to places from like Mexico to Germany to the States to the Mediterranean. And in fact, you could probably do a whole nother podcast on the idiotic adventures of Dan and Pascal. I mean, it'd be rated 18, so let's probably not do that. But yeah, and then it just flourished from there as a friendship. And I've known the lad for 16 years really, and we've not looked back. And we're obviously planning all this stuff going forward. So it's a relationship in a good place, I'd say.
So I think it's fair to say we're going to need to do a podcast once you've both left.
Yeah, I think so, and make it a 2-hour effort, because there'll be a load of stupid antics that we could probably capture in that one for sure.
Yeah, things we can't talk about today. So you hatched a plan, Stars and Spokes. What was your original plan? And where did the idea come from? What inspired you both?
Right. Okay. So we hatched a plan. This is going back, for context, this is going back to a world pre-COVID. So at this point, when we first initially hatched this plan, there was no PCR testing, there were no face masks, nobody knew who Chris Whitty was, as some examples. That's the landscape we were in at that point. And our plan was to go big with a view to a challenge that would raise awareness and funds for mental health in the military, and specifically, of course, within the Royal Navy, Royal Marines, as the service we were in. And in terms of the scale that you referenced there, like everyone's different in terms of what they see as a challenge. And for lots of people, whether that's running your first 5K or 10K or doing like a half marathon, the London Marathon's coming up, which is great. And that's an adventure and that's a challenge for people, but it's very specific to the individual. Now, Dan and I we've done a bunch of endurance physical activity stuff before, both with work, but then also doing marathons or ultra marathons or Ironman triathlons or multi-day events. We've done all that kind of stuff. So we were looking at it through that lens. So the challenge we needed to set was going to have to be big. And ultimately, we opted for cycling across the mainland USA, the mainland of the USA, from California in the West Coast. San Diego would be the start point, across to a small little town called St. Augustine, which is on the Atlantic coast on the Florida side. So a total of 5,000 kilometers, so a pretty significant distance, and over a period of 35 days. Now, to give you an example, on a daily basis, taking into account some rest days along the way, we're looking at 160, 170 kilometers daily on the bike, day after day after day. So a pretty significant challenge. And the US being as it is, we scoped a few different countries to potentially do this in, but the USA was chosen because there's quite a wide range of landscape types and challenges physically as you go through. So you turn up in San Diego, you kind of straight up into the high temperatures, you're straight up into the high passes, like some of the mountain passes in the first third of that ride are up at sort of 10,000 feet. That's how high you're taking the bike up and over, which is like 3 times the height of Ben Nevis. The temperatures at the same time are like up into the mid 40s, which is pretty warm. And then you're through some other desert stretches where it approaches up towards 50 degrees, which is insanely hot, clearly. And then further on in the ride, you're through the rolling hills of Texas and then into the deep south, which, you know, there's that threat of hurricanes as you go through that section, through Louisiana, and then on to Florida at the end, having completed 5,000 K. So that was the challenge, and that's why we went with something of that scale, if that makes sense, just for context. Yep. And so in terms of why this and what the overall aim here was, so what we wanted to do was, to, as I say, to raise both awareness and funds for mental health stuff within the Royal Navy, Royal Marines. Now, on the awareness side, this was, I suppose, more internal, so looking inward towards the service. The beauty of an endurance or an ultra endurance activity like we were going to do is that it is very much 50% physical, 50% mental. And that was really key for us in terms of trying to raise awareness, because within the military, we are very good, and we've been good for a long time at physical fitness. You know, at the top end, our Royal Marines, our Special Forces, the SBS, and even just the day-to-day average individual within the Royal Navy is physically fit. We've been doing that for a long time. At the top end, we're operating at the same level as at least elite sports people. You know, so all the programs that sit below that and train us up are brilliant, and they have been for many, many years. We have some of the, some of the fittest troops anywhere in the world serving within the military. What we have been historically poor at is the mental fitness, which is something we are rapidly trying to catch up on. So the good news is we've recognized that that is something that's really important, and we are getting there. And I think that's probably broadly equivalent of society more generally. You know, mental health awareness is improving all the time. And in terms of the COVID stuff, I think that's probably sped up how aware we've become around mental health. So what we're able to do through our challenge is we sort of hook people in terms of the physical challenge, because everyone in the military loves a couple of idiots going off and doing a big physical challenge, and that's what we are, and that's what we're doing. And so you kind of draw them in, and they talk about all the physical aspects, as we always do, and we steer it down the route of saying, look, yep, it is physical, but the other 50% here is mental. It's about mental fitness. And what we've done specifically is There's a tool that's been brought out within the Royal Navy within the past few years, which is called HeadFit. And it's a really important, valuable mental health tool, which gives you loads of kind of coping strategies and initiatives in terms of how to manage your mind, which is as important as managing getting your legs turning around on the pedals on a bike for 35 days. And we spoke about it in some of the stuff we did when we were talking during the Le Jog challenge. To give some examples, breaking a day down, like goal setting, positive self-talk, all of those coping strategies that massively apply when you're doing an ultra endurance event are absolutely key. So to use one of the examples in terms of being on a bike, I'm on a bike for 10 hours of a day. What I don't do is jump on my bike first thing, start pedaling, look at my little bike computer and be like, right, that's 1 kilometer done. Okay, yep, okay, 2 kilometers, right, only 240 kilometers to go. Do you know what I mean? Because the mind can't manage that. So by breaking it down, and what I do is break it down into sort of 45-minute chunks or smaller little windows, and you work through to the next bit and then to the next bit. And then eventually you've got to the end of this 230, 240 kilometer day after 10 hours, and you've got there because you've applied mental health good practice along the way. And why that's important is that we can then take those lessons and those coping strategies that we've demonstrated through an ultra endurance activity and put those onto and apply those to real life.
Yeah.
So if you're not going to structure your day correctly and you spend a week, you get up on a Saturday and you're like, well, what am I going to do today? I haven't got anything planned. I've got no goals, nothing to aim at. I'm being negative, etc., etc. You might leave yourself open to something like, for example, gambling. It's an easy win, isn't it? You pick up a little gambling app, you're like, right, I'll put a tenner on Man U to win 2-0 this afternoon. That'll generate my excitement for the day in the absence of anything else. So what we're trying to do is steer people away from that and help them appreciate through our activity the importance of mental fitness as much as physical fitness. So that's the awareness bit. Does that make sense, what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, absolutely it does. Yeah, because when we talked to Hugo Heggs Mitchell, who rode across the Atlantic, he was talking about head fit, I think, is that right? Have I got that? Yeah. And the importance of all of this. So it's obviously across the services and in the various branches as well, which has got to be a good thing, because we know boys in particular are a bit rubbish at this, aren't they?
Yeah, they are.
Looking after our mental health is not something we're always that good at.
No, and often the most important first step is to just bring it into the conversation. And as I referred to earlier, that hook of talking about an endurance event, which everyone loves in the military, and then shaping it around to being more about mental health is a great in. And we've promoted loads of good discussion about it. And it's really growing as an area within the Royal Navy, Royal Marines, which is fantastic. So that's the awareness bit. And then the second element is looking to raise funds in support of military mental health, which we're doing in conjunction with the Royal Navy, Royal Marines charity, which is the official service charity of the Royal Navy, Royal Marines. And that's real mental health in that regard is also incredibly important, because then you start bringing into it families and the potential impact that service life can have on not just those serving or ex-serving, but the families, which and they really bear the brunt of so much that happens. And I can think of a couple of examples from the front line, which I can talk about now. We'll certainly pick one of them and talk about them, which really bring home the importance of provision of mental health support to families. And I can go into detail if that's something that you want me to do.
Yeah, if you've got an example, I think that would be great for our listeners to hear, to understand, what you've seen, really, what experiences are happening. Yeah,
so to give a really good example from the air world, so both Dan and I flying helicopters. I was lucky enough to go down the attack helicopter route. Dan was programmed to go down the submarine hunting route, but ultimately flying helicopters around the world in various war zones. Now, whilst we have our primary tasks when we're in the helicopter, which for me was, attacking stuff with missiles and guns and all that good stuff, okay, fine. We always have also is what we call the MEDEVAC role, so the medical evacuation role. And if I use an example from Afghan, say, so you're flying a sortie, you're flying a 2-hour sortie against Taliban-related targets, most likely, whatever. Throughout the course of that sortie, if there are troops on the ground who have had an incident, and often in Afghanistan it was IED related, but the same applies at sea if someone has an accident on a ship. Your helicopter generally will get retasked to say, right, this individual here has had 2 legs blown off, basic first aid has been done on the ground, but ultimately he or she needs to be taken to a medical facility very quickly. And so whether that's in Afghanistan or whether that's at sea where someone's stuck on a ship and they need to get to shore, the helicopter is absolutely invaluable, because what we do is pick an individual up, we fly in a straight line at 150 miles an hour, not having to worry about roads or turning or other threats. We just get people to a medical facility incredibly quickly. And that is absolutely key. There are important periods you need to get someone to a medical facility within an hour where possible, and you greatly increase the chance of saving someone's life, because even within somewhere like Afghanistan, the medical facilities, to use Camp Bastion as an example, are top level, and there's lessons learned from Camp Bastion that are being applied in hospitals in the UK now. It was that good, and our job was to get them there as quickly as we can. Now, because of the critical situation people were finding themselves in, sometimes when you're flying someone on a MEDEVAC back to a medical facility, you've got all the medics in the back working on the individual, trying to keep them alive. Sometimes it doesn't always work out. So, a lot of the time you get them back to the medical facility, great. Other times, the individual unfortunately passes away over the course of that hour-long or 2-hour-long sortie. And that's an incredibly sad situation. And I found those moments deeply personal, in as much as suddenly it all goes quiet in the back. There's not that rustle of activity. The medics aren't doing anything. And the reason being the individual's passed away. There's nothing else that can be done at that point. And that's a really precious moment to be involved in. And I wouldn't necessarily know the individual in the back. It's just someone who's been picked up. But to be present for when someone's passing away is a deeply emotional moment for everyone present. But I think the second order effect to consider is, at that point, there is a family back in the UK who doesn't know this has happened. And when they find out, it's going to absolutely crush them from a mental health perspective, because either mum or dad or brother or sister, they are not coming home. And often when you do frontline operations, you're sort of in that age of 20 into your 30s. So a lot of the time you're with a young family. You might have a young child. I myself have got a daughter, young daughter of 7 years old. Dan's got a couple of young kids as well. So it's really close to home. But mum or dad, who they may have waved off 3 months ago off on this deployment, right, I'll see you in 6 months, they're not coming back. And that leaves a massive hole in the family unit, however that family unit looks. It doesn't matter. And now the service, the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines, are really good at providing care there and then and over the first few weeks or several months or whatever it might be to the family that's left picking up the pieces. But the impact, the mental health impact of that, if you take a child who's 6 or 7, who's just starting to get to know mum or dad, loves them, suddenly has no mum or dad coming back, the mental health impact of that is going to last decades, frankly, all of their lives. And what needs to happen is the long-term provision of mental health assistance to that individual, to that family. And that is where the Royal Navy, Royal Marines Charity fits in. They work alongside the military in terms of the provision of mental health in the first instance, but then stay with that individual and offer help and support to that individual for as long as it takes. And they do that through the programs that are funded through donations that come in, and hence why we're trying to cycle some push bikes across America to get some of that money in at the front end to help those sorts of families that may find themselves in those situations. And Dan and I have first-hand experiences of that kind of stuff happening. We have seen firsthand the epic support that the charity provides, and that is why we are riding our bikes across America, basically.
Wow, Pascal, what a fantastic explanation. I think if for our listeners wanted to understand why you're doing it and the importance of charities within the military sector more broadly, that's a fantastic explanation. And well, thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, it's a big old topic, and it's one that we aren't necessarily that keen to talk about a lot of the time, but it's really important we have those sorts of discussions, and then people can make progress with things like mental health, which is what is underpinning all of this cycling around, both on the Land's End to John O'Groats ride and the US ride next summer. So yeah, any support, financial support people are able to give, great. That's ultimately where it's going. If you feel that's a worthy cause, then please do make a donation here or there, big or small, it doesn't matter. You're a legend as soon as you make a donation.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think the importance of actually talking about your mental health, or talking about our mental health, is something that sometimes we do struggle with. So if there was one piece of advice, I think that's probably it, isn't it? Seek help from whomever that may be, whether it's a friend, a doctor, a charity. It really doesn't matter, does it?
100%. That is a huge first step, going from having it all in your head to vocalizing it to someone who you trust. And then suddenly all these doors just open up in front of you and people are there to help. There are organizations out there to help. Just make that first step and your life will improve. It won't be an overnight improvement, but over the subsequent weeks or months or years or decades, however long it takes, it will only be better as a result of having taken that first step of reaching out and talking about your mental health.
Absolutely. Thank you. So coming on to the Land's End to John O'Groats, the LeJog, as you call it, which I always kind of say incorrectly, so I'll say it the longhand. You kind of had to do that because of COVID, didn't you? When you you've already alluded to there was a world before COVID. I mean, I think we're probably all struggling to remember what that actually looks like, but hopefully things have got better. Let's hope they continue to get better. So you then decided that you would do a training ride, Land's End to John O'Groats with Dan.
Yeah.
And of course, that didn't really pan out exactly. So briefly, could you just tell us a little bit about that, please? Because then we'll come on to the United States in a bit more detail.
Yeah, okay. So with about 3 or 4 months to run to this summer, the summer just gone, it rapidly became apparent through our liaison with the British Embassy out in DC that the US thing was going to have to be parked because of COVID, moved to summer 2022. Fine. Okay. So what do we do in place? It was clearly going to have to be something UK based. We opted for like an absolute classic within the cycling world, the Land's End to John O'Groats ride. So a 2,000 kilometre unsupported ride starting at Land's End, kind of going via Portsmouth for various reasons, and then up to John O'Groats over the course of 12 days in total. So somewhere around about just under 200 kilometers a day. And the idea was to use that as a training ride, Dan and I riding this together, understanding a bunch of lessons identified out the back of that ride, which we could then apply to the US next year. And so we did that in August this year. So about a month ago, we kind of finished that off, and that went well, apart from one thing.
Which was?
Yeah, so I mean, the two became one. I don't want to get all Spice Girls on you, but two became one in as much as, so I got a phone call from Dan about, I suppose it was about a week, 10 days before the start point for Land's End to John O'Groats. And as I picked up the phone, I could hear a load of activity in the background, like a couple of planes taking off, a bunch of shouting. I was like, oh no, these are not good signs. Like Dan's line wasn't great, but I could just hear a few things. And he was like, yeah, hello mate, how are you? I was like, yes, Dan, I'm fine. How are you? Where are you? He's like, I'm in Cyprus. And for anyone who's in the military knows that Cyprus is normally a jumping off point for either going out to Afghan or coming back from Afghan. And I knew Dan hadn't been in Afghan, so that left the other option. Dan had just been short notice deployed out to Afghanistan to help with the whole Kabul stuff that we've just seen in the news recently. And at that point said, look, mate, I don't know how long I'm going for, but I'm not going to be around for LeJog. It's kind of over to you. So what initially had been an unsupported pair ride had suddenly turned into a solo unsupported 2,000 kilometer bike ride. In a nutshell. So let's just talk quickly about that as well, because I must admit, one of the things I was really struck with about, because we were obviously catching up pretty much every day. I mean, I know I was taking the mickey that it was basically a tour of coffee shops, but we can talk about that later if we need to. I still think it's the case. But seriously, one of the things that you kept mentioning to me, which had really stuck in my mind, was about the people you met. Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are two really big takeaways, I would say, from that ride that I learned, certainly. I'll get onto the people in a bit, but if I could talk maybe a little bit about the scenery, because that
of course.
When you go from Land's End through to John O'Groats, you're covering every element of the epic island that we live in. Britain is a stunningly beautiful island, and I think sometimes we maybe lose sight of that. We jump on an EasyJet flight to wherever it is. We're like, we need to have a holiday here, there, or everywhere. But ultimately, Britain is absolutely stunning, and the landscapes you go through on a bike, they change day by day because there was no because I was covering around about 200k a day. One day you're in the rolling hills of Cornwall and Devon, passing all these lovely little fishing villages, and then a couple of days later you're in the shady forests of Hampshire, and then you bypass London, and then you're through the farmlands of Middle England, and then the stone walls of Yorkshire appear, and then Hadrian's Wall, and then you're on into Scotland. That landscape changes day by day on a bike because of the distances you cover, which you don't see if you're doing it on foot because you're moving too slowly. You don't see it in a car because you're really shut off from the environment you're passing through. Whereas the bike, you cover the perfect amount of distance and you're completely immersed in that landscape. And it was amazing to see one end to the other, how brilliant the country that we live in and how varied it is. Now, to go back to your point, in terms of the people you meet along the way, that kind of runs in parallel to the landscape. So things like the accents, for example, change all the time as you go through, and so the Yorkshire accent is very different to the London accent, to the Cornwall accent, to the Scotland accent. And I did this weird thing, and I know now I'm saying it out loud, it sounds really weird, but like as I was going through and I was stopping at petrol stations and the accent would change, I'd listen to the accent, and then off I went, drunk my water and carried on my bike ride. And then I'd try and like replicate out loud like the most recent accent I heard. So there was this weird Navy lad just cycling through Britain doing these shouty, slightly rubbish accents for all the different regions that we go through. I meant no offense by it, but it's just fascinating how those accents change over quite a short period. But what I would say is a constant, irrespective of accents, is how generous and how engaging everybody is, particularly when you're on a bike. You just stop somewhere, people come over and chat. It is brilliant. So not only is the country beautiful, it's full of absolute legends from top to bottom. There may be some non-legends within there, but the vast majority, total legends. And we live in a beautiful place would be my takeaways.
I can't believe, I'm so disappointed to hear that you didn't do any of those impressions when we were doing our little broadcast, even off air. This has come as a big shock to me.
No, and I'm not doing one now, Steve. So you can park that idea straight off.
Well, I'm already imagining your deep South Mississippi drawl.
Well, exactly. And the same will apply in the States, I'm sure. The various accents, again, will change quite quickly. So that'll be fun. And hopefully Dan will be there to actually listen to my amazing accents rather than being an Afghan.
Well, by the sounds of things, you thought he was there anyway when you said we.
Yeah, it's a unique look, but there's nothing wrong with talking to yourself, Steve. Nothing wrong at all.
So were there any unexpected challenges that you'd like to tell us about?
Well, so the first one obviously is the one that we've just covered, whereby we went from thinking it was going to be a pairs ride to being a solo ride. And there are huge implications on mental health of that, actually, because it's great to have a second person to say a bunch of stuff to you out loud. And, whether you're doing a long hill climb and you're halfway through and you're like, this is really hard work. When it's just you're like, you don't have anyone to talk to about it. Whereas when Dan's there, I'm like, Dan, this is really hard work. And he'll be like, yeah, I know, mate, but we'll be up at the top of the hill in 3 minutes and then it's a downhill. Great. Just having that conversation is huge. Whereas I was having to internalize all of that. And I don't ride for reasons of road safety, I don't ride with headphones in or like a podcast or whatever. I've just got my head, I'm just in my head. I mean, we chatted every day at lunchtime, which was like counseling, which is lovely, Steve. But beyond that, I was just by myself. So
hold on, I want to interrupt here because I think you actually said you look forward to it. Unfortunately, I didn't record you saying that, so I can't prove it, but I know you did. You can deny it.
And I will. So so that was a really big unexpected change. And that meant a lot of sort of shaping in terms of my mind and how I approached it was a big difference. So that was very unexpected and hard to work through. And the second unexpected element, I suppose, or the biggest second unexpected element was the weather. And we spoke about it obviously en route, but it was a game of two halves in as much as the first sort of 6 days or so, it was just consistently 30 degrees every day. Like I can't think back to another period in my adult life where it's been 30 degrees in the UK 6 days in a row. But obviously, as soon as Muggins here gets on his bike from Land's End, straight away, I mean, I left at 5 a.m. and I checked the temperature and it was like 21. I was like, oh dear, this is not a good sign. And, going on through southern England into middle England, it was just 30 degrees every day, which put a real spotlight on both my hydration and my nutrition approach, because what you can't afford to do on a multi-day event is allow yourself to get dehydrated, because then the next day you start off dehydrated and then it snowballs from there. And so that was a big old change, and I had to adjust my technique to basically stop at every petrol station I saw and just down like 4 liters of water on the petrol forecourt, looking a little bit like a madman, but that's absolutely fine. You got to do what you got to do, Steve, haven't you? So
you have, yeah. So does this mean that your 30 degrees in Cornwall has prepared you for 40 plus degrees in the Nevada desert or wherever it is you're going to be?
Yeah, and so that's a really good point. In as much as it was harder doing it in those conditions, it absolutely was prepping me for what was coming next year, and the temperatures are going to be even higher, obviously into the mid 40s in the States. So a good learning curve in that regard. And then the second week, by contrast, once you cross into Scotland, then obviously it just rains and there are storms the whole time, and there are some big old headwinds on some pretty open expanses. I don't know if you know places like Rannoch Moor or in the Scottish Central and Northern Highlands. There's not much around by way of protection, and when the weather is up, you just got to put your head down and crack on. But when there's a headwind of 20, 30 miles an hour directly into you, and you're giving it your all and you're going at 5 miles an hour, it's hard. When it's that rainy and it's that stormy and windy, you can't see the tears, you can't hear the screams. So that's fine in that regard, but it is really hard as you're plowing through 200k days in those sorts of conditions, a real mental test. And that's why I go back to the point about endurance sport being 50% physical with the legs turning on the pedals, but absolutely 50% a mental game. So yeah, they were some of the unexpected elements that really impacted and made it a lot harder, actually.
Yeah, I'm joking aside. I know that it was a bit of a surprise, wasn't it? Some of the conditions, and it was a bit of a struggle, especially on your own from the sort of mental health point of view. So I guess you're about to commence training now for the United States. What's the plan there?
Yeah, so the LeJog stuff finished around about a month ago, and we've really been having a lot of time off the bike. And Dan subsequently got back from Afghan, so is just reconnecting with family after a long period away. So we're doing nothing bike-based really now until about mid-October. And in the interim, I've just been eating every cake I can lay my hands on, because you kind of fall into that routine, but I'm not doing the bike bit. So, there's a bit of plumpness appearing here, there, which is fine because it's a down period and that's good for our minds as well. But yeah, so we commenced the US training program in the middle of October. And then we've essentially got, like an 8-month runner preparing, ready to fly out to San Diego in July next year. So cool. Yeah, a big old detailed plan is in place.
So shameless plug time. Some sponsors might be of interest. If we've got any sponsors out there in podcast land, what sort of how do you sponsor a bike ride? How does that work?
Yeah, so there are a number of ways in which you can do it. And we're open to any form of these approaches, to be honest. For us, underpinning all of this is the cause. So if you are a big company out there and you feel that mental health within the military is an important thing, not just within the military, within families as well, then you can directly make a donation to the cause. We've got a target of £15,000. Post LeJog, we've got to 5,000. So if you're a company out there that wants to put in a generous donation, then brilliant. We've got a big old social media footprint, so we can provide exposure that way in return for any donations. And obviously you're making a difference, which first and foremost is hopefully why you're doing it. Yep. So that's one option in terms of getting involved if you are a company. And the other is through the provision of equipment. So if you are like a big bike brand, or you're a camping brand, we're doing wild camping for 50% of our nights. So we stay in military accommodation for half the nights, and then we wild camp on the roadside for the other half of the night. So if you make bivy bags or you make a sleeping bag or whatever it is, any equipment that you want to push our way, clearly that's gratefully received, because Dan and I are overwhelmingly supporting this from our own personal funds. So it's costing us several £1,000s to do. So any support would be epic. Yeah, and so we're under the banner of Stars and Spokes across our social media. So if you plug that in, then you'll find us. And likewise, starsandspokes.com has all the reference material in there. And I'm sure you'll probably stick it in the show notes there, Steve.
We will do. Absolutely. We'll put that in there so people can find out more. So as an individual, you're going to be using Just Giving again. Is that how it's going to work? And then people can just make a donation if they want to, or hand you cash if they bump into you?
Yeah, that's the plan. So we have a Just Giving page. So it's justgiving.com/Stars and Spokes. We regularly update that, and you can make donations through that route, which is brilliant, which a lot of people were doing during the LeJog route. And I had a little T-shirt made up and had some lines on my back outlining how to donate. And along the way, the generosity of humans in Britain was unbelievable. Hundreds of pounds came in, whether that was through the Just Giving site or just hand us the pounds or the dollars as we go. And we promise not to spend it on cake, and we'll put it towards the cause. At least 90% of it will go to the cause and not on cake. So no, all of it goes to the cause. So,
to ensure that happens, I think you should give all the money to Dan, because I know what you'll spend it on, and it's cake.
You're no more reliable on the cake front than I am, I can assure you of that. So that's not a solution to the cake problem.
Well, it was worth a thought, wasn't it? It was worth a thought. So I would just like to say thank you ever so much for agreeing to come on and talk to me again, because I would have thought I'd put you off by now, but clearly not, or you must be desperate. And also, once you've completed this ride across the United States, love to have you back on board and see how that went as well, what the differences are, and what you've achieved as well by doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, be really keen to. If you could avoid wearing a a loud pink shirt next time we do this. Obviously on the podcast, you won't hear that, just to save my eyes. That would be great. But yeah, so next July, August, next year is when we'll be doing the state stuff. So you can follow our training through the social media. And we would love to come back and chat to you again in August, post the US ride, Steve. It'll be a pleasure.
Thank you. So word of advice, don't insult the person who's got all the sound recording equipment, because I can make you say anything. So my shirt is lovely and you were jealous, admit it. But anyway.
It's a beaut.
But thank you for coming on the podcast. Brilliant. Thank you very much.
No worries, Steve. Thank you.
Well, I hope you did find that interesting, as I promised earlier, Michael. I think that was a very interesting chat.
Only my wife calls me Michael when I'm in trouble, so I'm just wondering what I've done wrong to be called Michael. But anyway, I'll accept that. I thought it was more than interesting. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And, you know, we're going to talk about men who wear lycra, aren't we?
Your favourite subject, I believe.
And then that would be telling. I don't want our listeners to get too much of the wrong impression anyway. So, Stars and Spokes, a journey across America, unsupported, for a pair to happen next August.
Yes, that's the aim, raising money for the Royal Navy Royal Marines charity. But things didn't quite pan out the way they expected, because they were rather hoping to do that this year, had to do it next year because of our friendly COVID, which we know has affected so many things. But nonetheless, I think it was still very much worthwhile. And they did, of course, raise some funds for the charity.
Yes, because I think they described it as a training ride between Land's End and John O'Groats. I would hardly call that a training ride, but I suppose in the context of 5,000 kilometres across the States, it probably is. And then, of course, it was meant to be the pair of them, and only one of them turned up.
I know, but he did have a good excuse. He had a good note from teacher, so to speak.
Yeah, that Dan had to be in Kabul as part of the evacuation of British servicemen and women and citizens in the last month or so.
Yeah, and that must have been quite a challenging job indeed.
Absolutely. Anyway, I mean, back to the overall quest. So this is, from what I understand from the interview, all about raising both money and, more importantly, awareness of mental health in the military and their dependents, their families.
Indeed it is. And Pascal explained that. I was just wondering what you thought about that as well. I'm sure you'll come on to this.
Yeah, well, he was talking about... actually, you asked him to give you an example, and he talked about... I think he had a tour in Afghanistan as a helicopter pilot, ferrying... doing whatever job he did, but then being retasked to ferry medical evacuations, casualty evacuations from places where people had got hurt. And he talked about the process of having someone in the back of the van, as they call it in a helicopter, that sadly might pass away before they could get them to medical help. And the impact that had on him and his thought processes about what that impact would have on that person's family, their wife or husband, normally wife, or their dependents, or indeed their parents, and the impact that they had, not in the short term, but for a very long period in time afterwards.
Yeah, I thought it was a very good kind of explanation of his motivations, actually, and also kind of talk about the wider impact of, being deployed in a conflict zone.
Absolutely. I'll go further than that. I'd say that was one of the best explanations of why they're doing what they're doing that I have ever heard. I thought it was really well articulated. And actually, he talked about how good the Navy, the Royal Marines are at in the short to medium term, dealing with looking after the families and helping with the grieving process. But he then spoke about the role of charity, the Royal Navy, Royal Marines charity in particular, that takes up the longer term task, because these sort of mental health interventions can last a very long time, and the Navy and the Marines aren't there for all of that. That's where charities like RNLC come in. So I thought that explanation he gave was absolutely brilliant.
Yes, and the reality is many of these challenges don't manifest until people have left the service, and sometimes long after the service as well.
Yeah, the Royal Navy Royal Marines charity are still talking about people, coming out with PTSD from the Falklands, and that's nearly 40 years ago. So these things do take a long time sometimes to surface.
And also, not only that, it's about having the courage to actually say that you have a problem and seek help wherever you may find it.
Absolutely. So really strong message there. And actually, I know towards the end of it, there was a call to arms for people, individuals, companies to donate or to donate equipment and things like that for the Stars and Spokes epic journey across America. I think if they just listen to that aspect of the interview, hopefully they'll be reaching for their back pockets before the interview's finished.
Yes, we're going to be twisting some arms, aren't we, hopefully?
Yeah. Absolutely. So going to the Land's End to John O'Groats, which, as you said, didn't quite turn out as planned, in that it was meant to be an unsupported pair cycling from the southwest tip to the northeast tip of Great Britain via a number of bases. 2,000 kilometres, so 200 kilometres a day over a 10-day period. And then, as you said, Dan had got extracted to go and help with the evacuation of people from Kabul. So Pascal did it on his own. Incredible, really. Incredible. I mean, he called it a training feat. That would be a massive challenge to me on its own.
Absolutely. I mean, I've got an electric bike, as you know, and I cycle about 4 miles a day, and that's quite enough for me. So that's an epic feat as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
What I like though is how he explained his mental process of dealing with it. He didn't say, "I've done a kilometre now, 1,999 to go." He said, "I've got it into chunks of doing 45-minute chunks of doing so much, and he would concentrate on doing that 45 minutes or an hour, whatever it was, and then he would then chunk the next bit, and I thought that was a really interesting way of how he dealt with it mentally. He talked about his own mental preparation for this in terms of doing it. He said actually it's 50% physical, 50% mental health. And he went through his mental process of doing it. And then he said, actually, that might be cycling from John O'Groats to John O'Groats from Land's End, but actually it's something you can apply to everyday life as well. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and it's a good example. It's easy for people like me to understand, I think, and that's a good thing.
I think anything that makes it easy for you to understand is a good thing, Steve.
Yeah, always working to the lowest common denominator.
No, but I think, for anybody, so to our listeners, in terms of dealing with, negativity or lack of sense of purpose, the ability to break things down and think things through in terms of what sort of chunk can I achieve? What sort of what footsteps can I do to achieve something? I think is a great example of how to deal with, people that have perhaps lost the sense of purpose and need some help in regaining it.
Yeah, and it can be anything, can't it? I mean, you could just be like step counters and getting some exercise. You can see how much you've done one day, and then you can do a little bit more the following day. And just breaking down the things that might at first seem to be quite difficult or even insurmountable. And just break it down to little chunks and getting those. He talked a lot, actually, when I spoke to him, when he was actually doing the challenge, about how important it is to sort of set goals that are measurable. So even tiny little changes. I mean, Pete Reed talked about that a lot as well, didn't he, in his training? It's very important.
It's really important, and I thought it was really well explained. So the next big challenge, which because they're having some downtime now, but the training starts for real back in mid-October, is summer next year, when they're going to cycle from San Diego to Florida, 5,000 kilometres, again unsupported, across the United States of America. What a fantastic challenge!
Yeah, and I can't believe he was complaining about the heat in Cornwall. It's going to be a bit different, isn't it?
Yes, 30 degrees C, he said, for the first 6 days, and the amount of water that he had to take on board to just stay hydrated. I was based in the the United States after my submarine command for 3 years, so I know how hot it can get in the summer, particularly in the southern states. So, yeah, that's water is going to be the most important factor for their cycle, outside of mental preparedness and physical strength.
It sure is. But I mean, what a cycle ride, isn't it? I mean, they're going to see some amazing scenery and really see the US of A in a quite different way.
He did, yeah, you're absolutely right, because he talked about seeing Britain in a different way from on a bike when you're only, you're cycling slow enough to take it all in, but fast enough to make progress. That you don't get on foot or driving in a car. He said how stunning he thought the landscape was between Cornwall and Scotland, and how varied it was. And of course, that's going to be true across America as well.
No, I was just going to say, and the people as well. That's another part of it, isn't it? Just sort of meeting. I'm sure the reactions in the United States are going to be completely different than over here in the United Kingdom.
Well, I loved his little anecdote about mimicking the accents of people he met along the way, and how much they changed, and so I can just imagine the southern drawl in Texas or Louisiana if he and Dan continue to do that. I think you should, if you are able to record them, on their journey for a separate podcast, try and get them to replicate some of the accents they hear.
Well, we could start by you having a go. No, I joke.
I don't think our listeners would like that whatsoever.
No.
So there it is. They're going to cycle across America next year, 5,000 kilometres. They're going to do it as a pair but unsupported. A bit of wild camping, a bit of staying in bases, and they need your support, listeners. They need companies to make donations or donate equipment. They need individuals to go to the Just Giving page, and it's all to raise money and awareness for what the Royal Navy Royal Marines charity does in mental health amongst both the military and its families.
Absolutely. And we do have listeners in the United States. So, there are ways you could just support by showing up, I think, when we know what the route's going to be.
And are you hoping to do what you did on the John O'Groats journey in terms of have a 5 or 10 minute interview on a daily basis?
We will definitely be covering it on our page for sure, what we're working on at the moment. And, I've also roped you into this, as you know, is maybe slightly changing the format, because using the internet in the UK actually is a lot easier than getting consistent coverage in the US. So we've got some ideas, but it's watch this space, and it'll be on our page and, of course, Stars and Spokes page.
As long as I don't have to wear lycra, I'm happy with that. I know this is a podcast and listeners can't see, but they might have a mental image, and I'm worried about their mental health if they start to think about me in lycra.
This would be... It's just I can't bear the thought of it.
No, well, don't.
Listeners, don't. No, don't. Please do not encourage this. Although, perhaps we should say yes and raise some money for Stars and Spokes. That's a way you could contribute.
I would wear lycra if a suitable, sizable donation was made to this cause. And you could capture it somehow on video to put on the page. But it has to be sizable for me to even contemplate it.
Well, lycra is stretchy, so that size shouldn't be a problem.
I think we've given the listeners too much to think about on this one, so I think we ought to draw a veil.
So, what price, Michael, in lycra, listeners?
Who'd have thought that was going to be one of the outcomes from this particular podcast episode? Doesn't really bear thinking about. Stretches the mind too much, as well as the lycra.
Does indeed. So, thank you once again, Mike, and I will see you soon.
You certainly will.
Thanks for listening. The Royal Navy and Royal Marines charity exists to support sailors, Marines and their families for life. If you or someone you know could do with some support, give them a call on 023 93 87 1568 or drop them an email on support@rnrmc.org.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to hear more, please subscribe.